I'm Sander Gerber. It's a great privilege to introduce a man grounded in traditional American values, which he used to guide American foreign policy. Secretary Pompeo's range of foreign policy achievements and strategic leadership is impressive. From opening the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem to supporting Israeli sovereignty on the Golan Heights in Judea Samaria and helping to implement the historic Abraham Accords, labeling BDS as an anti-Semitic movement, and beyond Israel, advancing a human rights agenda around the world. Mike is no slouch in academics. He graduated first at West Point. He was on the Harvard Law Review, corporate lawyer, started a business, entered Congress, CIA, then head of the State Department. Pretty darn impressive. Mike is a guy who gets the big things right, from China, Israel, Russia, Iran. He's not a slave to popular opinion. Patient and persistent is a quality that defines Mike, and his many successes, for instance, China turning around Europe on 5G and elsewhere, the Gulf diplomacy, required long effort and bearing misplaced criticism along the way. Mike represents the best of American leadership, and I might add that our country is fortunate that he's still so young. No one is more fitting to receive this award, the Champion of International Human Rights Award, than my friend, our friend, Mike Pompeo. And now turning over the floor to you, Rabbi Shmuley, for the presentation of the award. Thank you.
Here at the 9th Annual Champions of Jewish Values International Awards Gala, we are extremely honored to present former Secretary of State Michael R. Pompeo with the Champion of International Human Rights Award, our first such award. Secretary Pompeo distinguished himself, serving as America's foremost diplomat in always fighting for, upholding, and passionately promoting a human rights agenda that was reflective of America's highest ideals for liberty, freedom, human equality, and human dignity. Secretary Pompeo helped to enact the toughest sanctions ever against the terror-funding Iranian regime with their genocidal intent against Israel and the Jewish people, even as others turned a blind eye to Iran's barbaric treatment of its LGBT citizens, hanging gays from cranes in town squares, their brutal abuses of women, including the unspeakably barbaric practice of allowing women to be stoned to death. My father was born in Iran, and to see that country descend into that barbarity because of its government, which murders and slaughters its people, is nothing short of tragic. Secretary Pompeo assisted in enacting the toughest ever sanctions against the mullahs so that Iran could no longer finance the slaughter of innocents throughout the globe. In addition, Secretary Pompeo stood up proudly against the ferocious slaughter and genocide of the Uyghur people in Xinjiang province in China. Secretary Pompeo has always stood with the Middle East's only democracy and bastion of human rights, the State of Israel, against international demonization and anti-Semitic attacks. For all these reasons, and for serving as an American light unto the nations, the World Values Network is so pleased to award Secretary of State Michael R. Pompeo with a Champion of International Human Rights Award. Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us at our gala. My respect for you is immense. I watched you with such admiration as you represented our nation throughout the world, upholding the highest American ideals of goodness, of righteousness, and justice. And thank you so much for accepting this award. And it reads, to Secretary of State Michael R. Pompeo, Champion of International Human Rights at the 9th Annual Champions of Jewish Values International Awards Gala, the World Values Network, February 18th, 2021. And then we have the Jewish lunar date, the 6th of Adar, 5,781 years since creation. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you. First of all, thanks for the kind words. They are so humbling. The service that I have been able to perform is something that's in my heart, not just when I was the Secretary of State and the CIA director, but during my time in service in Congress as well. This relationship between Israel and the United States is unbelievably important to the American people. It's great that I've been given this award about human rights. It's something I've cared about deeply. I first started thinking about this when I was a cadet at West Point. Now, goodness gracious, I don't want to say how long ago, too long ago, about life and how responsible sovereign nations have an obligation to protect not only their own citizens, but do a good turn in the world as well. And that a strong America and partnering with democracies like Israel can lead to a better place and a better world. I then saw up close and personal the threat that Iran posed. And when I think of Jewish values, when I think of these Abrahamic traditions, I'm a Christian evangelical believer. When I think of the Abrahamic traditions and the values that your organization puts forward in the world, this is something that I know we all have an obligation to continue to fight for, to continue to work on. You mentioned Western China. We talk about what happened in Germany in the 1930s, and we say we'll never permit these kinds of things to happen again. We've all said it. They're happening there today. They're treating these people with forced abortions and sterilizations and putting people in things that look and feel like internment camps. We all know this isn't right. And we know that the regime in Iran would do that with every ounce of energy in their being. We only have to listen to the words about their intent on the destruction of Israel, the Jewish homeland, and their denial of history. It's important for America to stand for that. I was proud of the work that our team did, that our administration did for the entire 4 years. I'm incredibly humbled and proud of the fact that you have selected me to receive this award. Thank you for that. May the Lord bless all of you. And I look forward to our conversation today very much.
Well, your Christian faith, as an Orthodox Jew, it animates me. We in the Jewish community, the evangelical Christian community, are our dear brothers and phenomenal lovers and defenders of Israel. As Secretary of State, you traveled to Judea and Samaria, the first ever Secretary of State. You actually visited the Psagot Winery, which is owned by a very dear friend of mine. We actually had one of our weddings there, and we love Psagot wine. But of course, the biblical heartland of Judea and Samaria is where King David was crowned. It was where the tabernacle of Shiloh stood for 369 years. And for you, as America's top diplomat, to help connect the Jewish people with that ancient homeland is something for which we will always be so grateful. I don't think we've ever seen friendship towards the Jewish state coming from an American Secretary of State as we did with you. In fact, we didn't. Let me not, although I lived in England for 11 years, let me not here employ British understatement. We never did see anything like it. And your trips were historic. And in the last few days of the administration also, the way you spoke about Judea and Samaria and the proclamations you made were nothing short of historic. And, I wrote a book called Kosher Jesus, and it was an attempt to serve as a bridge, a theological bridge between our Christian evangelical brothers and sisters and the Jewish community, because I think faith is what really binds us. And the fact that you take the Bible so seriously and see it as something that can animate and inspire, even modern diplomacy is critical, because of course Israel is nothing but the culmination of Jewish dreams and Jewish prophecy for 3,300 years. So, Mr. Secretary, I'm humbled that you've accepted, and we really look forward to seeing you to continue inspiring America with the values that animated your time as our Secretary of State. We look forward to seeing you, God willing, returning to positions of great influence in the United States. You have a great fan in me. I was mentioning to you just before the presentation of the award that I was actually present at the Security Summit in Warsaw. And for someone who just about to publish a book called Holocaust Holiday, strange title, but it's about the 100 extermination sites that I took my children to visit in Poland in the summer of 2017, and the devastation it caused to the family, for Holocaust memory. Our 8-year-old daughter, who was born July 3rd, begging us not to celebrate her 9th birthday in Auschwitz. And to go from seeing that kind of devastation to our people, to the Security Summit where you spoke, and Vice President Mike Pence spoke about, Iran wanting to enact a second Holocaust, and the Vice President actually used those words, and the phenomenal speech that you gave. And I remember that you were being challenged at your press conference that I sat in on. I was sitting next to the New York Times reporter, and they were hammering you like, aren't you guys overdoing it about Iran's threats? And you said, you all said, no, we're not overdoing it at all. That the fact that this has been allowed to go on for so long, these genocidal threats against Israel and the Jewish people without without a strong response from the United States is unacceptable. So I cannot thank you enough, because one Holocaust was something that our people will never quite get over. And the fact that we're being threatened with a second is just absolutely shocking.
You know, your comment about my trip to Judea and Samaria, it was controversial. And I suppose I knew that. And on the other hand, I was surprised at the way that the controversy was presented. It was really important that an American Secretary of State go there for scores of reasons, but not because it was controversial, but because it's simply the right thing to do. One of the things that we did, and your point about the Warsaw Gathering, which really laid the foundation for the Abraham Accords, right? It was a place where we had nations, Gulf nations, come together with Israel in Warsaw, in this historic, important place. Warsaw was picked with great intention. My trip, Warsaw, the work that we did to sanction the regime in Iran, they were all based on reality. Not some fantasy about the way we'd like the world to be, but a deep recognition of the threats that are posed and the goodness that comes from our faith, and our obligation to use that as that faith as an animating force to confront those evils. Those were the reasons for the actions that we took. I've watched, frankly, this isn't partisan. I've watched administrations from both political parties sometimes mouth the words, but to not acknowledge the true risks and the real facts. And I think without a deep understanding of how religion drives behavior, and an equal understanding of how we should respond in a way that is appropriate to that, I think we're destined to live in a world that looks very, very different. And the risk of a second Holocaust, the risk of real tragedy befalling people of faith around the world, is something that I'm perfectly happy to have the New York Times give me a hard time about. I'm untroubled by that. The mission's too important to allow some organization with its own agenda and its own worldview to push us off the square that we know is the rightful place for America and for Israel.
Well, your time as Secretary of State, I think, was often distinguished by your strong opposition to Iran. And I mentioned, my father was born in Iran. He was born in Esfahan. And of course, there was a mass exodus of the Jewish community. And it was the oldest Jewish community in the world, older than even than in Israel. My family has been in Iran since the exile after the first temple, 2,400 years. And you could see Iranian Americans now, who number in their hundreds of thousands, their deep connection to their country. My father never stopped speaking Persian. He passed away during the coronavirus. I'm saying the Kaddish prayer 3 times a day for him. Never stopped speaking Persian. Never stopped eating khormeh sabzi. And Iran has a beautiful, incredible, spicy cuisine. Never stopped listening to Persian music. And they always spoke of the tragedy that the brutal Khomeini regime came in with such an anti-Semitic agenda, and of course started labeling America the great Satan, and took our embassy hostage, and then of course started labeling Israel the little Satan. And then it got worse with these constant genocidal threats. And what shocked me about the Iran nuclear agreement, and as you said, this isn't partisan because human rights is not partisan, but the 1948 United Nations Anti-Genocide Convention, which expressly forbids any kind of genocidal rhetoric, any kind of genocidal threat. And the United States is a signatory to that treaty, as are 183 nations. And while the JCPOA was being negotiated, they continued to threaten the Jewish state with annihilation, destruction. They said it was a one-bomb state. They said it was a scab on the face of humanity. They said it was a cancer. And this actually violated international law. I never understood it. And I speak not as a Republican or a Democrat or a progressive or a conservative. I don't speak as a Jew or as a non-Jew. I speak as an American. And it was the greatest generation that liberated the camps. One of the people we have in our Gala, Mr. Secretary, is an African-American GI who was one of the first to liberate Buchenwald under General Patton's Third Army in April of 1945. And we go from being the greatest generation that liberated these camps and stopped the evil of Hitler to kind of funding a regime that is speaking about slaughtering the Jews all over again, let alone, death to America, death to America. So the moral clarity you provided, I have to tell you how comforting that was for me, because I don't feel that as an American Jew, I have to listen to some government threatening to annihilate my people all over again and then being rewarded with the unfreezing of assets to the tune of $150 billion. I don't feel that I have to go through that again. I didn't do anything wrong to deserve to hear that I'm going to be killed and murdered and slaughtered. We have 3 children who live in Israel. So you have to understand how hearing one of the most powerful men on earth, the Secretary of State of the United States, the Secretary of State of the United States saying, this is never going to fly again. You have to understand what comfort that brought. We felt we had friends. We felt we had supporters. We felt they had people who actually gave a damn about us. And so comforting. And that's why we're so grateful.
Well, I'm glad you felt that way because you did. And you do have friends. And you should all know that legion of friends is large. It is broad. And even in places that have not always honored that, their governments have not always honored that. As I traveled the world, I saw people from countries that frankly weren't prepared to stand up to Iran. I saw their people share a central understanding. You talked about human rights. It was so much at the center of what I was trying to do. I created this commission and I asked them to go look at human rights. And I did it in the sense of, I wanted them to go back and look at the American tradition in particular. Every nation has its own history of human rights and how they think about it, and then a national theology, if you will, about how human rights rises up. Our founders in America had that too. And we know the history of Israel. We know it's deeply embedded in Israel's founding. But we went back and looked at it. And you know what I found was there was enormous commonality. I had the chance to go to Indonesia and speak before a group of very dedicated people who are trying to stamp out extremism inside the Islamic faith. And we did a little bit of work on the tradition there inside of Indonesia. They too have an understanding of human dignity. And every leader, all of us with the capacity to exert influence, have a responsibility to talk about this, to speak with deep moral clarity, not to round any corners or any edges, and to focus on the fundamental dignity of each human being and these traditions. And when we do that, good things happen. When we don't reward the kind of behavior that takes place inside of the leadership in the Islamic Republic of Iran, when we call it out for precisely what it is, we create a momentum, a force, a power that is unstoppable. I am confident that people around the world now think about Iran differently than they did when our administration took office. And while the next administration may choose its own tactical plan, I don't believe it's the case that anyone will ever again deny the threat that the Islamic Republic presents to the United States, presents to Israel, presents to Arab nations in the Gulf. And I think the Abraham Accords are an outcome of all that effort, right? That work laid the foundations where Arab nations could once again articulate publicly that that hostility and antagonism and threats to Israel aren't the morally right thing to do. They're not the right thing to do for sovereign nations. And once again, are now beginning to, we call it normalization. But the reality is, it's just to recognize the right of Israel as the Jewish homeland and say, we want them to be brothers in love, brothers in faith, brothers in commerce, and brothers in security, all the things that nations do together. I am incredibly proud of that outcome. And I am especially proud of all the work that so many people did to put into that, to allow that outcome to transpire. It was historic in the sense of you now have a warm connectivity between these countries that is incredibly, incredibly powerful.
Well, you reshaped the entire Middle East, and with due respect to former Secretary of State John Kerry, who said that there would never be peace treaties between Israel and the Gulf states until there was peace between Israel and the Palestinians. I think the Abraham Accords shows that, you know, where we can get peace, we take peace, and we don't allow one conflict to define the entire region.
Amen.
And one final thing, Mr. Secretary, and I thank you so much for your time, but you know, Hakarat Tov, acknowledgement of goodness, gratitude is, in my opinion, the highest of all Jewish values, or an organization that promotes Jewish values. I wanted to express one more article of gratitude. Obviously, the central teaching of the Bible, because it's right there in the first chapter of Genesis, is that God creates humankind in his image, which leads to 3 things: that all human beings are equal, all are of infinite dignity and value, and all have infinite worth. And I wanted to thank you and the Trump administration for what you did in Syria, because you know, Samantha Power is a good friend of mine. I was even there at her confirmation hearings in the Senate when she became President Obama's ambassador to the United Nations. And our friendship largely relied on her being this great moral voice against genocide, especially in her 2002 book, A Problem from Hell. And when Syria came around and she was in office, I would say to her constantly, I went to see her at her office at the American mission at the UN in New York City. And I said, Samantha, this is the great test. This is the great test. They're slaughtering innocent Arab children. They're using mustard sarin gas against them. And you gotta do something. And I found it astonishing that it was specifically President Trump and his administration who were constantly accused of Islamophobia. When the president saw Arab children foaming at the mouth from poison mustard sarin gas, images that will haunt us, will haunt the world forever, he fired American missiles because those lives would not be taken with impunity. They had value. I had a conversation once, Mr. Secretary, with Elie Wiesel, the great Nobel Peace Laureate, and someone who worked with me fighting the Iran deal in 2015. We did many full-page ads in the New York Times. And I once asked him, about a year or so before he passed away in 2016, I said to him, I used to call him Reb Eliezer. I said, Reb Eliezer, did you want the United States to bomb Auschwitz? He said, of course, we all wanted that. I said, but you would have died. You would have died. He said, but I would have died knowing that there's justice in the world. And when President Trump fired those missiles at Bashar al-Assad for killing Arab children, I know it didn't stop all the slaughter. I know we Americans are weary of a nation building, nation intervention. Not all of our Middle East wars have gone as planned. So, but it showed all of those Arab Muslim children and families in Damascus, in Aleppo, that there's justice in the world, that the United States cares. And I needed to the most senior diplomat of the administration, I wanted to tell you what that meant. It was historic.
Well, thank you for that. I remember those discussions. It was precisely that what you described, that President Trump understood, and he gave us the courage and an understanding of the moral imperative to do precisely the action that he took that day. To your point, it didn't stop all the slaughter, and it is still tragic what's taking place there. But we demonstrated, I think, to people all across the world that the United States was going to be a continued force for good there.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. God bless you. And
God bless you.
I hope that you'll have this award hanging on your proudly. I know you've got like 10 billion of them, but give us some pride of place. Okay?
I'll do that.
Thank
you, sir.
God bless you.
Thank you. So long. God bless you.